lie, deceive, mislead. These are Russian President Vladimir Putin's tactics as he attempts to push the narrative that Russia is winning the Ukraine war handily. He wants his people to believe that everything is going great on the front lines. But the truth is far different from the alternate reality Putin is trying to present. Russia's fake victories are being exposed, and this is the brutal truth about what's really happening. First, there's the town of Chasiv Yar. For over 16 months, that small Ukrainian town has been the subject of brutal attacks by Russia's forces, as Putin desperately tries to claim the settlement. And on July 31st, Putin claimed that Russia had finally gotten what he wanted, says NBC News. Chasiv Yar had fallen, with Russia marking its so-called victory by launching at least 308 drones and 8 cruise missiles into other regions of Ukraine, killing at least 6 people, including a 6-year-old boy. The town, which is home to around 12,000 people before Putin launched his brutal invasion, already lay in ruins thanks to Russia's constant assaults. It had become a ghost town in the civilian sense, transformed instead into one of Ukraine's key fortress cities in the Donetsk region. Putin wanted to collapse that fortress, both for a symbolic win that he believed would shatter Ukraine's morale, and because Chasiv Yar is important, very important. Reuters points out that the town held strategic significance for Ukraine earlier in the war, thanks to it being located on raised terrain. That allowed it to serve as both a regrouping point and a forward artillery base from which Ukraine could launch assaults against Russia's invading army. Chasiv Yar was a stronghold, a location that, thanks to its geography, terrain and urbanized setting, was the perfect place for Ukraine to dig in and cause serious attritional damage to the Russian troops attempting to take Donetsk. For Russia, taking Chasiv Yar represents taking one step closer to overcoming Ukraine in Donetsk. The town will provide Russia with the ability to circle another of Ukraine's fortress towns, Konstantinovka. That encirclement will allow Russia to attack from all sides, trapping the Ukrainian defenders in the town so Putin's forces can wear them out until they eventually fall. So, the capture of one of Ukraine's fortress cities in Donetsk will lead directly to the capture of a second. Chasiv Yar could also be used as a base from which to organize and launch artillery assaults, in much the same way as Ukraine used the town earlier in the war. From that base, Russia could damage Ukraine's Donetsk supply lines, weakening its defenses elsewhere. Russia doesn't automatically win in Donetsk if it takes Chasiv Yar. As former Kremlin advisor Sergei Markov points out, the city is no longer as strategically significant as it once was. But the capture of the city has symbolic significance. This is how the war could continue for many years to come. Slowly, the Russian army will advance. Reuters reports Markov is saying on Telegram. Now, Russia holds the city. Or so Putin claims. The reality is far different, the Kyiv Independent reported on July 31st. It says that Ukraine's military almost immediately denied Putin's claims that Russia had taken Chasiv Yar as soon as Putin made them. The outlet quoted Viktor Trehubov, who is the spokesperson of the Gortitsia group of forces that is helping to defend Chasiv Yar. He told RBC Ukraine, "The situation in Chasiv Yar is the same as in recent months. Russia is simply lying again, precisely so that the claim spreads through refutations." NBC follows this up with its report. It points to a Ukrainian online monitoring platform named Deep State, which published maps showing how much of Ukraine's territory Russia occupies. Chasiv Yar is on that map, which shows the majority of the town marked as being occupied. But a part of the town is greyed out, which NBC says stands for it being under unknown control. In other words, the fighting is still raging in those areas, which immediately disproves the Kremlin's claim that Russia has taken the entire town. None of this is to say that the situation in Chasiv Yar is good for Ukraine. As Blackbird Group monitoring group analyst Emil Kastelhelmi points out to the Kyiv Independent, Russia holds the vast majority of the city. "We've been able to geolocate Russians to many parts of the city, to the edges of the city," the analyst says. It's still possible that on the furthest edges and outskirts of the city, there is still some fighting going on, but it's very likely that the Russians control most of Chasiv Yar at this point. But most is not all, and that's the point. What's seen with Putin's Chasiv Yar lie is an attempt to mislead anybody willing to listen into believing that Russia has made more progress than it actually has. That's what Trehubov was suggesting when commenting on the Kremlin's claim. Even a lie that's easily refuted can pass for truth if it's repeated often enough. Even the refutations help to spread the lie, which is precisely what Putin is counting on. He hopes people will hear Russia captures Chasiv Yar and then fail to investigate any further. In reality, Russia is yet to take the entire city. Ukraine's defenders are bravely defending their positions. Given that Putin is so desperate to take Donetsk, the presence of those defenders is an affront to one of his major goals. Lying about the fall of Chasiv Yar is a tactic designed to make Russia seem much stronger than it really is. And even if the city is on the verge of falling, it doesn't change much, according to Castelhelmi. Even though they are now claiming this, the front line hasn't really moved much from the point where it was last week. So in that sense, it's not really a very radical development. The big Russian victory in Chasiv Yar hasn't happened, and even if it has, it doesn't mean much. Of course, this now raises the obvious question. If Putin is willing to lie so openly about the situation in Chasiv Yar, just what else is he lying about? So much, starting with Russia's casualty rate in the Ukraine war. This next grand Russian lie is revealed courtesy of United 24 Media's Roman Kohenet. He reports on a joint investigation conducted by the Russian media outlet iStories and the Kyiv Independent that reveals Russia is engaged in a systemic practice of reclassifying soldiers who are missing on the Ukrainian battlefields as deserters rather than casualties. Kohenet brings up the case of a soldier named Dmitry Saryov. Deployed to Ukraine in 2022, Saryov soon went missing in action after a Ukrainian strike against his unit that led to heavy losses. Saryov's body was never recovered. Russia happily took the opportunity to tell the soldier's family that he had chosen to leave his unit voluntarily, officially labeling him as a deserter. Saryov's mother had her doubts. "They told us Dmitry ran away," she told iStories, "but that's impossible. He was proud to serve." Saryov joins hundreds, perhaps even thousands of Russian soldiers who the joint investigation says have gone missing in action and have now been classified as deserters by Russia. There is no confirmation of any of these desertions. It seems Russia is lying about the status of these soldiers who are likely dead on the Ukrainian battlefield rather than running for their lives through Ukraine while somehow avoiding capture by either Ukraine or their own soldiers. But why the lie? Well, there are two reasons, starting with Putin's desire to hide Russia's massive casualty rate. Russia doesn't want to admit to anybody just how high a cost Putin has allowed its military to pay during a war that was meant to be over in 5 days, but has now raged for 3.5 years. And there are figures from Ukrainian sources. Ukrainian's Ministry of Finance reveals that Russia has lost over 1.05 million to death, injury or capture in Ukraine as of July 31st, and it currently has a casualty rate of about 1,000 soldiers per day. However, the average Russian doesn't know anything about that. Putin has designed it that way. Earlier in July, Newsweek reported that the Kremlin has officially stopped reporting on the number of deaths Russia is experiencing in Ukraine in a desperate attempt to conceal the country's losses. Bear in mind that this official Russian reporting would have already been manipulated to be as favourable as possible. The fact that Russia is hiding even those massaged figures reveals everything. Newsweek points out that Rosstat, which is Russia's state statistics agency, hasn't released any key demographic data at any point during 2025. That data tends to reveal at least a portion of Russian casualties, though even that isn't fully accurate. After all, only the Russians who have been reclaimed from the battlefield and confirmed dead are reported. Thousands of Russia's soldiers never make it into the data that Rosstat reports. And now, thanks to Russia's false classification of dead soldiers as deserters, many more will be scrubbed from the casualty numbers. As with the Chasiv Yar lie, All of this is in service of making Russia appear stronger than it really is in the Ukraine war. The fewer deaths that are reported, the better Putin can claim his military is doing on the battlefield. And the second reason for this deserter lie comes down to one thing: money. Putin has made a huge deal over the fact that the families of any Russian soldiers who are confirmed to have been killed in Ukraine receive bumper compensation packages. Note the word confirmed. That word gives Russia a lot of leeway to massage the death figures so that it can weasel its way out of paying the families who have lost loved ones to Putin's brutal invasion. And Russia needs to start lying about these deaths because its compensation program is costing it an arm and a leg. Business Insider made that point back in July 2024 in an article where it pointed out that Russia would have to spend 6% of its entire 2024 federal budget to deliver the compensation it promises to the families of its wounded or dead soldiers. The total bill for last year would have amounted to about $26 billion, though whether the Kremlin paid out anywhere near that much isn't known. A human rights lawyer named Pavel Chikov spoke to United 24's Coanet about the situation, stating, "By classifying missing servicemen as deserters, the Ministry of Defense not only relieves itself of financial obligations, but also raises these deaths from the statistics. And if a Russian family dares to challenge the official ruling of desertion through the Russian legal system, those challenges don't get far. There isn't a clear mechanism to make such a challenge in Russia. Those who attempt to create their own through their request to learn more end up receiving heavily classified documents and a complete lack of access to their family members' military records. That assumes they don't simply receive a complete refusal. Putin has set up a nice little system for himself here. He gets to act as the altruistic leader of his people, the man who will ensure Russia's people are compensated fairly when they lose their loved ones. But in reality, he tries to avoid paying that compensation as much as he can, both to save money to feed into his war machine and to hide the fact that this very same machine has led to far more death than he ever wants his people to know about. That's all without even mentioning the thousands of people who've died for Putin's cause fighting in paramilitary and militia groups. The BBC said back in February that the pro-Russian militia fighting in the Donbass had lost between 21,000 and 23,500 of its fighters. The deaths of all go unreported in Russia. In Chasiv Yar, Putin is lying to claim a victory that Russia hasn't earned. With his fake deserter labels, he's lying to hide the fact that his fake victories are coming at a high cost that most of Russia's people would be unwilling to pay. Another of Putin's attempts to deceive comes from his claims relating to the Kursk Oblast. Kursk may be familiar as the Russian region that Ukraine successfully counter-invaded back in August 2024. Within a couple of weeks of crossing the border, Ukraine managed to occupy about 500 square miles of the oblast, forcing Putin into a response that saw him collect a fighting force of about 50,000 to push Ukraine out. Russia even accepted around 10,000 soldiers from North Korea to help it retake Kursk, which is another fact that Putin went to great lengths to avoid admitting as it was happening. That counteroffensive was successful, according to Putin. On April 26, Putin declared victory in Kursk. The BBC reports that he claimed that Russia had pushed Ukraine out of the oblast entirely. A leading Russian commander named Valery Gerasimov backed that claim, stating that the last village Ukraine held in Kursk had fallen back under Russian control, officially ending the Ukrainian incursion after 8 months of fighting. Gerasimov also said that 76,000 Ukrainian soldiers had died or been wounded in the fighting, which the BBC says no other source had been able to independently verify. Of course, this was a lie. Even at the time, Ukraine was quick to point out that Russia was nowhere near the point where it could claim to have completely retaken Kursk. It said that its troops were still conducting operations in the border oblast, even in the face of Russia's counter-offensive. Yes, they'd been pushed back, but they were still in the game. A couple of days after his April 26 announcement, Putin was even forced into a rare backpedal. The enemy has been driven out of the Kursk region, but some are still entrenched in basements and hideouts, Putin said. That's a far cry from Russia having 100% control over the region, and it reveals that Ukraine was still fighting. Around 2 months later, on June 22, the BBC revealed how deep Putin's Kursk lie went. It reported on comments made by the Ukrainian's military's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, who said that 10,000 Russian soldiers were still fighting against Ukraine's troops in Kursk. And they had to be. After all, Syrsky said, Ukraine still held about 35 square miles of the region. Granted, that's much less than it had taken in August 2024. But as with Chasiv Yar, it's evident from this that Putin had jumped the gun on his victory declaration. The reason for the lie was slightly different this time. While Putin lied about Chasiv Yar to claim a symbolic victory that Russia hadn't earned, Putin lied about Kursk to shield himself from the wrath of his own people. The Kursk incursion marked the first time since World War II that another country had managed to occupy any part of Russia. That humiliated Putin. It left egg on the face of a man who tries to position himself as Russia's protector, and it brought the war he started back to his people. The Kursk lie was yet more propaganda used by Putin to reinforce that image as protector, even as his troops still battle against Ukraine in an oblast Putin says is 100% under Russia's control. Now, while the three lies discussed so far were all told to hide the weakness of Russia's military, it's this next lie that has the potential to be the most devastating to the Russian people. What is that lie? The Russian economy is absolutely fine, and there's nothing for the average Russian to worry about. This is the claim that Putin made on June 20 amidst warnings from his own financial advisors that Russia is standing on the edge of a massive recession that could lead to the country's collapse. Whether through arrogance or a desperate attempt to hide the truth from his people, Putin quoted the great American author Mark Twain by saying, "Rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated," when responding to these economic fears. Putin at least acknowledged the importance of Russia's economic challenges, adding, "Our most important task is to ensure the economy's transition to a balanced growth trajectory. At the same time, some specialists and experts point to the risks of stagnation and even recession. This should not be allowed under any circumstances." What shouldn't be allowed? Russia heading into a recession, or the country's financial experts pointing out that it's going to happen? Whatever Putin's true meaning was with that particular quote, this is yet another lie that he's telling his people. Russia's economy is far from fine. While Putin may tout the alleged 4% economic growth Russia has received annually for the past 2 years, the reality is that all of that growth has come from Putin turning his country into a war economy. The situation on the ground shows that this type of economy can't last. Russia's base interest rate is 18%, making it incredibly difficult for its people and businesses to take out loans. And both need the extra money because Russia's annual inflation rate was 9.2% in July. That massive figure actually marked a decline from earlier in 2025 when the rate exceeded 10%, but it's still so high as to create a cost of living crisis in Russia. Business Insider said on July 30 that the International Monetary Fund is predicting a massive slowdown of Russia's economy. Growth will still come, but it will only be at 0.9% rather than the 1.5% predicted back in April. And there's still plenty of time for the growth predictions to come down even further, and perhaps even reverse, as the West places more sanctions on Russian oil. The same outlet also revealed back in January that Russia has burned through $86 billion of its national liquid reserves, with those reserves falling from a pre-war high of $117 billion to just $31 billion by the beginning of 2025. In other words, Russia's emergency fund is rapidly disappearing as the country risks being plunged into economic chaos that Putin denies is happening. No wonder Russia is lying about soldier desertions to avoid paying compensation. Putin needs every ruble he can get as his country faces financial collapse. What each of these massive lies demonstrates is that Putin is a man who has fallen entirely into his desperation. Russia's leader is desperate to claim that Russia is achieving major military victories when it isn't. He's desperate enough to lie about the fate of his country's soldiers to hide the toll his war has taken and avoid paying compensation to families. And he's desperate to downplay the economic turmoil that's heading the way of a country that's already struggling with high interest rates and rampant inflation. None of Putin's lies hold water. These four have all been exposed, as has Putin. The reality is that lying can only take Putin so far, no matter how often he does it or how good a liar he is, before his web of deception crumbles around him. And as Putin lies and misleads, he's also having to deal with Ukraine achieving very real victories against Russia. Ukraine has taken back what's theirs by liberating a Black Sea island in a bold naval raid. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war.